Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks for coming. Well, you know, when you get older, you worry that no one will come to your talks anymore. Also, nonetheless, I'm very pleased to be here. First of all, I like Kansas City, just for no particular reason. And secondly, that the library that we're in right now is what today's topic is all about. Now, let me make sure I'm hearable. So you folks up there can hear, okay? Can hear? No. That's as far as it goes.
Let's see here. Try speak louder.
Let's try that. A little better. Oh boy, I hate technology. All right, I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. Those of you who are blocked by columns, well, that's your own fault for sitting behind a column. All right, so the subject on the table this evening is what libraries are all about and what they're metaphorically all about, which is a big idea that most of our fellow citizens buy into, and that is that we, all of us, have an obligation and also a right to work hard and to better ourselves intellectually and also economically from what we learn. You might say it's the entire premise of public education. And the subject on the table is the possibility that this era where that's an accepted idea is going away. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And needless to say, as an academic myself, I hope it doesn't. But for reasons I'll explain this evening, those are the signs I'm seeing. So it's very serious. Now, this is, as you know, showing Thomas Jefferson is the first resort of scoundrels. So I don't want to be a scoundrel. I merely want to make the point that the thing we're talking about today is civil rights, I mean a human right. Now, Jefferson himself thought about this, particularly in the context of Wright's patent, which is an English invention. And he didn't like it very much. He didn't like the idea of knowledge being property. He said in a letter to one of his friends, knowledge seems to be divinely created to be copied. The analogy is, I bring my taper to yours and I light the fire from it and take it, but I have in no way diminished yours. That was his idea of the ideal of knowledge. Now, that said, he was also a business person, actually a rather lousy one. But he was in favor of gambling, actually. Jefferson was, because he sort of knew that a lot of economic life, practical life economics, involves risking and winning. So the fact that poker is a popular game is not surprising. It's a little metaphor of how every single one of us makes something out of nothing. You have to take risks and you have to benefit from them. And that's sort of what's at issue here. We have two things that are self-evident: the need to make a living on the one hand and the need to grow on the other, that aren't consistent with each other. So anyway, this is something that's hit home at this particular time in history, and yes, it is a Jeffersonian issue. Now, when I was preparing this talk a couple of years ago, oh dear, don't stand there. Okay. I found this fortune cookie, and I liked it so much, I scanned it. So this is the actual fortune cookie, and I got it down a little south of Palo Alto, and of course what it says in Chinese is the same as what it says in English, that the only true good is knowledge, and the only evil is ignorance. Now, you all know there's something wrong with that, but it's kind of hard to put your finger on because every one of us who's been a parent has actually said those things, okay? You must study because learning is good. But there's something off here, and that's where we're going to start the discussion. Now, one of them is sort of obvious. You go to your friends, your neighbors, and you ask them if they know all about Frankenstein. Every one of them understands that idea very well, that people will get knowledge and they'll do evil things with it. In fact, they understand that much better than the good things. So you start regaling them. You say, well, think of all the good things. Think of all the computer software. And they get angrier. Right? And all the great cars you can have, they get even angrier. Okay? Most of us have a rather ambivalent feeling towards the technical means by which we live, even though we need them. And we don't just need them a little bit. The modern city, as we know it, is already too large physically to sustain itself with horsepower. The horses can't eat enough food to get the provisions into the center of the city. So were all the machines to stop working tomorrow, the great city, as we know it, would disappear, and all of us would starve. So this is, when we talk about the good in question, it's not abstract, it's very concrete. Anyway, this particular idea is something that most people understand very deeply, at least they think they do. Now, this is a biological example. Here's another example that's a little more close to home. This is nuclear bomb class. Now, clearly, we shouldn't do this. Now, I like to show this slide because I myself am a physicist. I'm trained in that stuff, and I could very well have nuclear weapons class, but of course I don't. Why not? Well, it would be bad. It would also be a felony. Well, that counts too, but the point is there's a higher principle here, that we know that this particular thing is not good. The thing that we're talking about is basic things, like how nature works inside of nuclei. And your neighbors who know the Frankenstein myth will also tell you that they're pretty comfortable with having this particular knowledge disappear, as it has practically done. This happened in the late 1940s, early 1950s, with the passage of something called the Atomic Energy Act. And that law made certain kinds of basic knowledge that you could discover on your own if you did some experiments, classified. That is to say, it is against the law to talk about those things in public, even though they are self-evident, even if you found them out on your own without stealing any government secrets. Now, so the world we actually live in is a world where we as a body have decided that certain kinds of knowledge are not we don't want them around. Okay? Now, this kind of knowledge is a little more subtle. There are actually two kinds of knowledge sequestration issues on the table here. One of them is security. The other one is gambling. And here, let's imagine that I go around the table and I look at the hands, and then I whisper to everybody what's in them. Okay? What would happen? Well, I'd be killed in 2 microseconds, but let's just say that the game would end and everybody would stop playing because poker is about fooling people into thinking you have more than you really do. Now, the relevance of this to our living is because the higher levels of our economy work exactly this way. Nobody likes to think about their livelihoods as being a gambling undertaking, but that's precisely what it is. And if you recall what happened in 2008 and 9, is that the people in Wall Street stopped playing. And the people in government who were very savvy about this said, "Oh my God, they've stopped playing. Give them more chips." Give them more chips. It's like the gods playing games in the sky. If they stop playing, we'll die. And this is actually true. If they stop playing, if they stop gambling, then we fall into a terrible depression, which does result in certainly great unhappiness, but also death. So the gambling is not a mere detail of economic activity. It's actually central to it. And that in turn means that telling perfect transparency is poison to economic activity. If everybody knows everything about everything else everybody else is doing, you can't, there's economic activity stops and we all croak. Now, so there we are. We have 2 reasons why the fortune cookie wasn't wrong. One is because of Frankenstein, and the other because total knowledge for everybody means no economy. Now, let's talk a little bit about what kind of knowledge we're talking about. Since most of you, well, presumably everybody, has been to higher level school, you know in our education system there are 2 kinds of knowledge, the good kind and the bad kind. So the good kind is Socrates. So that's obviously Socrates. He's just taken the hemlock, or is about to take it, I guess. Everyone is crying. He's pontificating. And we read about this in Plato. And of course, it's quite wonderful. It's 2,000-year-old literature, and yet it's very fresh today. And so, yes, that's worth reading. But if you remember how we do it, we tell the students, this is good. We're going to send you to Harvard for God only knows how much money to learn about this, okay? Because this is good. But we don't want you learning about this. This is auto shop. And so auto shop is for people who are not good enough to understand Plato. Now, at least it was when I was a kid. My father would not let me take auto shop even though I really wanted to, because I love engines. And it was a bad decision, actually, because knowledge of engines is a very useful thing to have. But let's say lots of parents go through this. If you let your kid do auto shop, the kid won't do other things, and that's bad. So now let's stop a minute and think why there is this dichotomy. Well, you say, well, the Platonic kind of knowledge is good, it's useful, and this kind of knowledge is not useful. But that's not true. That's definitely not true. When your car is broken, Plato won't fix it. You know, you need a good mechanic to fix it, and and then you say, well, this is a bunch of detail and it's complicated, and that's why it's not so useful. Well, why is it complicated? It's perfectly obvious. I think it's complicated because it's valuable. The person who knows how engines work is perfectly capable of explaining it to you. They just won't. You've got to pay. And you're laughing about this, but it turns out that the abstruseness of scientific literature is actually due to this very simple principle. All science that's important is actually simple. But you can't make a living making simple things. You can only make a living making complicated things. And so people in my discipline make things complicated on purpose for the express purpose of preventing people from understanding them unless they pay. Now, I hear you're laughing, but this is no joke. It is not, you'll find, you ask yourself, why does the scientific productivity today seem so mediocre compared to Galileo and Newton? That's why. Because the economics is different. And it's very, very serious. We're talking about a very large amount of money getting spent and much less and less return. And obviously something is off track somewhere, okay? And what we're talking about, I think, is what that is. If you haven't understood the economics correctly, you won't understand the intellectualism either, because every one of us is an economic animal. So the point of this picture is that we got it exactly backwards. The reason we teach Plato in school is that it is not important. I mean, it's important conceptually, but it's not valuable economically. And so we make it clear and transparent, and we impress each other with it. But the knowledge with which we make a living is in a very different category. It's profane rather than sacred. It's complicated, and it's important. And so, actually, our prioritization of our knowledge base is backwards because we have a backwards understanding of the economics involved. Now, this is important because the knowledge sequestration I'm talking about is mostly technical. And you can say, well, who cares about that? It's just technical knowledge. That's a sort of second-class kind of knowledge. But as I've explained, this is backwards. It's the technical knowledge that will better you. It's the technical knowledge that's expensive. It's the technical knowledge that's complicated on purpose so that you can't use it unless you pay. And so the sequestration of this kind of knowledge is the serious part, the part that will affect how you live and what kind of a life your children will have. Now, this is blasphemous on purpose. There are lots of technically trained people who feel awfully exasperated by the constraints on what they can do imposed by conditions of security on the one hand or economic competitiveness on the other. The idea that you work very, very hard to make knowledge and then you find that some of the knowledge you've made is not acceptable. We do, in fact, live in a book-burning time. The nuclear stuff I told you is an example. If you'd like another example, just think for a moment about what you know about genetics, about how we went through the genetic revolution and then suddenly it became mediocre. That's not an accident. What happened is it became classified. De facto classified, and that means that very large amounts of genetic knowledge are now off limits in the public domain because they're too dangerous. So anybody who's going to make that kind of knowledge is not welcome in town. We live in a society that is doing this. So the thought to get impressed here is that I don't like book burning any better than you do, but we have a conflict between the need to do this in order to prosper on the one hand, and our gut instinct that somehow it's not right, that we don't want to be a society that burns the knowledge. Now, here is a textbook example of the problem you get into. This really happened. This is on the defense side of the equation, not the economic side. This is a famous issue of a left-wing publication in Minnesota, I think, called The Progressive. And in it, a journalist named Howard Moreland published a theory of how hydrogen bombs work. that he alleged that he got off of public sources. And what happened, if you don't remember your history, what happened is the Justice Department enjoined the journal from publishing this. And obviously it got published. What happened was there was a big hoopla about it, and then some documents appeared out in California that allegedly spilled the beans anyway, and so it got published. Now, there was at the time in force a famous law, the Atomic Energy Act, which made doing stuff like this a felony. And there's, of course, another example of that same problem recently, which is the famous Wen-Ho Lee scandal at Los Alamos. And in both cases, the government did not prosecute. Now, because they didn't prosecute, it never came to court, and so you don't really know, but the facts are suggestive that they think the law is unconstitutional. In other words, that if you ever took it to court, what would happen is the entire Atomic Energy Act would be struck down as a violation of the First Amendment, whereupon you would have a flood of nuclear information for the terrorists. So the way our society has decided to handle this is by just not adjudicating it. I like to say that we live in a society that's half Athens and half Sparta. And this is the Spartan part speaking. It's self-evident, the judge said, that this is so dangerous that it overwhelms everything, including the famous principle of prior restraint in the law. And so it should definitely not be allowed to be published. What subsequently happened was that the nuclear agencies in the states simply ignored it. They didn't say what was right. They didn't say what was wrong. They just stopped commenting on it. So what you know is that some things in the Moreland article are correct and some things aren't correct, but you don't know which is which. And that's the way we handle sequestration of knowledge in a defense side. Whenever there's a conflict with civil rights laws, we just don't take it to court. I mentioned Wen-Ho Lee. That's another rather outrageous example of somebody getting locked up under the atomic energy law. But you see, if the government is afraid that the law is unconstitutional, what better way to send the message to would-be terrorists than to slap the guy in solitary confinement for a year and then say, oops. Okay, oops, sorry, my mistake. Well, surely the message got through. That particular case I know a little about. I was inside the fence at Livermore Lab for many years, and I assure you that every year we had briefings about how you do not take home PARD, that is to say, this particular kind of classified material. So there's no possibility that there was any misunderstanding there. So we live in this kind of weird environment on the defense side of the equation where we can't reconcile the need to be safe with the need to be open. And so the way we handle it is just not letting them ever come into conflict in the courts. Now, so that's a famous example. Now, here's another sort of famous example. You might argue, well, it's perfectly obvious that nuclear things have to go away because they're so dangerous. But then what about diesel? See, diesel, you make bombs out of it. In fact, the Oklahoma City bombing was made with barrels that were filled up with ammonium nitrate fertilizer, which you buy at the store, and then you put a little diesel in there and light it off, and it blows up. So you can imagine what would happen if you made diesel illegal. It would really be bad if you ran gas stations. The farmers would come with their serious guns, and They don't kid around. Not to mention the truckers, oh my God. So the idea that you're going to get rid of things because they're dangerous is not correct. What you actually do is make a balance. You balance, you make a compromise. Things that are powerful, that empower you, are dangerous by their very nature. So you do a benefit analysis. Does the benefit I get from this dangerous thing overwhelm the danger? So in the case of fuels, the answer is pretty clearly yes, and so banning diesel is a silly idea. Banning nuclear weapons, on the other hand, isn't silly because they're not useful. Now, what about banning other things? How about this? I'm sorry, I'm in the way. That's why you're not laughing. Standing in front of my own pictures. Everyone who's married thinks this is funny. Well, you might ask, why not ban long, pointy knives? A lot of people get killed by long, pointy knives. Well, you say, well, the answer, of course, is that long, pointy knives are too useful. They are used for murder quite a lot, but they're also used for cutting up the Christmas turkey, and then they're too useful, so you get rid of them. Now, it turns out that in Great Britain, there is a movement to get rid of long, pointy knives. Very serious. And then, I got to tell the story. I was at Google telling this, and I said, well, they will never ban long, pointy knives. And then some Russian put his head up, and he says, excuse me, Stalin banned long, pointy knives in Moscow. Now, darn it, I wasn't fast enough, because I had actually been in Moscow the year before with all this glittery new stores for all the rich Russians now. And what I should have said, well, Stalin is dead, but now there are plenty of pointy knives in Moscow. Right. So yes, so the danger side of things is a weighing that we do, and there is no such thing as absolute danger. There is only danger versus benefit comparisons. Now, let's talk about the other side, great discoveries. This is a famous mutant of Drosophila called Antennapedia. And you make it was made by accident, by X-raying the fruit flies. And what it is, if you can see there, it has legs growing out of its head instead of antennae. Okay? Now, for me, as a physical scientist, I find this mutant exceedingly interesting because it's giving you a clue about how body structure forms in living things. It's giving you a clue that sometime in the ancient past, legs and antennae weren't different. And what the mutation did is it threw back the differentiation between the two until antennae became legs. This particular mutant can also show up the other way. Interestingly, you can get antennae coming out of the body instead of legs. So as a basic science matter, this is something that's exceedingly important. It's telling you about how living things work. Now let's just imagine that somebody did this with a dog. Okay? It's in the paper, local paper. Extra, read all about it. University scientist makes dog with leg coming out of head. Okay? Now, would this guy or woman, as the case may be, going to Stockholm? Are we going to Stockholm on this? I don't think so. Why? Because people would find changing life, changing the way physical things, they would find that abhorrent. Most people would put that in the Frankenstein category. And so that person should not go to Stockholm. Now, it turns out that this kind of biological knowledge is part of the stuff that's off the table now. One of the issues that was involved with stem cell research is precisely this matter, that if you learned how morphogenesis works in living things, then you could engineer the genes to make plants and animals look like anything you wanted and have them do anything you want. And I think it's fair to say that most people in the world would not like that, even though I myself as a scientist would be very interested in knowing that. So this is a piece of knowledge that probably is not going to happen because it's too dangerous, and it's not nuclear, it's biological. Now, let's talk a little bit about codes, ones and zeros. Now we're getting a little bit into the other side of the equation, which is the economic competitiveness side. Genes and computer codes are not conceptually different. At the basics, they're fundamentally the same thing. Yet, in our laws, we treat them very differently. So, the ones and zeros are property. And the gene ones and zeros that are in your body or not, they belong to you. And so that's something that our society is wrestling with now. The computer side of the equation and the biological side of the equation are cousins, distant cousins of each other, and we can't reconcile in our heads whether they are dangerous on the one hand and whether they are part of the economy or not, to be bought and sold on the other. Now, the idea that genes are not laws of nature seems ridiculous to me anyway, most of the people I know, and yet that is precisely what has happened in our courts. So there are precedents in the patent literature that actually laws, that things, natural laws should not be patented. Nonetheless, the courts have sustained the patenting of gene sequences, ergo, gene sequences are not laws of nature. Or formulas. They're not algorithms or formulas. Now, so what has happened is we've made an artificial division between what you might say instruction sets based on economic expediency. And this problem is still working its way out. There are some people who think that that's, no human being made these sequences and so they shouldn't be property. And there are other people who think they must be because this is coming, this is part of the economy that's coming. And so therefore don't worry about it. Now, there's a beautiful example of this dichotomy, which is the difference between cloning and software. I was in South Korea when this came to pass. You may remember Snuppy the dog, which is the first dog clone. There are lots of clones. You don't read about them anymore because it's not news, but there are monkeys and there are donkeys, and there were probably people. If you remember, in those days, there was a tremendous scandal in South Korea about faking scientific knowledge about human cloning, lying to the journals and so forth. But you think about it for 2 seconds, it cannot be more difficult to clone a person than it is to clone a dog. It cannot be true. And so we're living in a time where the control of genetic expression for cloning is super sensitive. At the same time, not cloning professional software is bad. In other words, if I take the professional software and I change it and then I give it to you, this is bad. Okay, what I have to do if it only has integrity if I clone it. So on the one hand, we have an ethic that you must clone, and on the other hand, you have an ethic that you must not. Very confused. Now, when I was thinking about this long ago, it struck me that the source of the confusion is an ownership issue and has to do with incest, actually. The genes, what's wrong with cloning is that you're evading the process of rolling the dice when you have children. And somehow everyone knows that there's something wrong with that because it has to do, that process has to do with the way life works. Software, on the other hand, is made by humans, and therefore it works a different way. Namely, I make it, and then I sell you a copy, which you then use. So we are really confused about whether ones and zeros are part of nature or they're part of my company's portfolio. Now, this picture is obscene, and it's meant to be. This is, of course, a picture of Lady Justice dressed up as a clown. Now, the reason I put this up is because it's a metaphor for how a lot of 20-somethings think about all this. Namely, it's the sequestering of knowledge, not letting me know something because the knowledge belongs to someone else and is important for their livelihood, is something that they don't get. And this is part of the reason you have this rampant internet piracy. My sons are now older and they're beginning to get it. You know, if I steal from that person, he'll steal from me, and then, oh no. But nonetheless, this is what's inside the brains of high school students and 20-somethings now, namely that Lady Justice is a clown. Now, just to remind you folks, Lady Justice is not a piece of kitsch. She is a European invention that is an embodiment of logos. That is to say, a Greek idea that doesn't translate into English very well. It comes from Greek Stoic philosophy, and in Marcus Aurelius it translates either as God, nature, or logic, depending on the context. So, built into our jurisprudence and also the way we think about things as a society is that there's this kind of triumvirate of concepts that are mixed together very powerfully. So when we talk about desecrating knowledge or desecrating logic, it's somehow blasphemous. And that is not by accident. This has to do with very deep-rooted things that are in Western culture. So we're living in a time now where this is coming more and more and more to a head. Why? Because we have transitioned to something called the information age. A time when none of us is going to actually drive tractors anymore and make things. We're just going to have information and we're going to buy and sell it. And of course, except for the information that we sequester because it's too dangerous, the government can take care of that. But the rest of it, we're going to buy and sell it, and then we're going to live a life of luxury, except, oops, it is basic Econ 101 that if knowledge becomes your currency, you must have less of it. Because no one will pay for something they can get for free. And therefore, the decision to become an information society has a very dark side that I don't think any of us anticipated when it first began to happen, which is that a civil right, a human right that we thought we all had, namely the right to learn things and better ourselves economically from what we learn, is going away. And it's not going away because of evil government administrators, it's going away because of us, because if we all need to make a living, we need to get money in exchange for something, and if we're exchanging knowledge for that money, the knowledge has to be dear. So there you are, the dilemma, and this dilemma is getting worse and worse and worse, especially for knowledge enterprises such as libraries and universities. I'm in the university business and I fret over this every day. What's going to happen as this runs its course? Some of what we do will be criminal, and the rest of it will be economically marginalized because the things that count are the things you can't know. Well, the analogy I like to draw, it's a bit with slavery. If you remember your American history, while in around 1860, there was an immense literature on the slavery issue on both sides, and both sides of the argument had perfectly logical reasons why God was on their side. What they were doing was perfectly right. And if it was never resolved, what happened instead was violence. And the way the war came out determined the way that we think about that problem today. Now, will this problem result in violence? My guess is no, because people are pretty comfortable right now. But it's of that nature. Namely, it's something you're doing for economic expedience that you know deep down is wrong. something you do is something you're doing, it's wrong, but you have to do it because you have to live and you have to pay the mortgage and you have to raise the kids. So we are well down this slippery slope, and what will happen is anybody's guess. I myself am worried that the end point is the universities become irrelevant. And the entire premise of public education becomes a distant memory because it's incompatible with the information age. I'm glad you like this. I enjoyed very much drawing René Descartes in a jail suit. This is, I don't always feel this way, you know, it's only when the grant doesn't come in that I feel. At any rate, I like to end with this picture because it resonates with the students I deal with. I made this speculation that this problem is so profound and so important to how the world works today that it may never get resolved. In which case, this might be the thing that drives people off of this beautiful blue ball we live on. You see, you'd have to be a crazy person to live it voluntarily. It's so gorgeous and so perfectly suited to you. Nonetheless, people have done this before. They've gone to distant places for intellectual freedom. And so I make a speculative guess that this is actually going to happen, and that the immigrants that actually leave the earth will do it not because they don't like the earth, but rather they're lacking something they need to grow, which is intellectual freedom. Now, let me end on this note. You're a pretty mature audience, but when I end on this picture and I tell that little story, the students all clap. And then I get hands. Usually it's the young women. I want to go first. Thanks very much, everybody.
All right, we have time for questions. I'll bring the microphone around. Just please raise your hand, and I'll bring the mic around. Any questions?
Back there. Sir.
Boy. Okay. I was blinded by the projector light.
It's nice to have such a distinguished monitor, you know. Go to that man there. Give him the microphone.
I just want to say thanks for coming. I know you talk about loss of knowledge and loss of knowledge kind of driven by economy, and I wondered if you could kind of give your thoughts on the coming up of the final space shuttle launch and kind of the future of NASA and government funding in general for those kind of big idea, big scientific projects.
Sure can. See, you're a little young to remember this, but all of that stuff is a child of the Cold War. So big science as we know it, in fact, maybe even public science generally, is a creation of the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, it was very good for the world, but very bad for us professors. And those programs are hideously expensive, and their benefits are problematic. Now, there's one exception, and that is for military things. So the military parts of space are very healthy, and even though it's sort of sensitive to talk about, what we saw this week happening was partly due to spy satellites that can, look into your underwear. I mean, they're who knows what they can do? I don't even want to think about it. But the super collider, the big accelerators around the world, the big chemistry researches that we've had, they're all having difficulties funding, and the fundamental reason for it is that they're socialistic, and the military reason for having them has now gone away. So if you read your Constitution, nothing in the Constitution says the president must build big accelerators. Okay? It says in the Constitution the president and the Congress have to defend the country. And so those parts which do that are constitutionally solid. The rest of it is not. And no, I think they are slowly slipping away. Interestingly, they're slowly slipping away in Germany also, and that's fascinating. So I go there on business a lot, and you remember that before the Nazi time, the Germans invented government science as we know it today. And so it's even more painful to them to watch it go, because this is something they invented. Okay? Quantum mechanics, physics, engineering, well, and of course, poison gases, but never mind that. I've had audiences in Munich that are just like this one, where everybody's wondering, you know, what are we getting for our money? What's happening? Where is the future going? And all I can tell you is that there's a lot of consternation around the world along these same lines, and it's all a consequence of the Cold War issues having gone away. Sir. Yeah.
Thanks for the great talk. I have a couple of questions. Well, just could you comment on, are you trending in the direction of conspiracy versus just circumstances in your comments here? And then could you comment on modernist philosophy versus postmodern philosophy, and how postmodernism might be affecting the scientific inquiry right now?
Okay, let me do the second one first because it's easier. As you might guess, I am the avowed enemy of postmodernism. I am a 19th century man, and I just want to break out a machine gun and shoot those guys. But I'll probably get arrested as a terrorist for having said so. But I trust that answers your second question. Now, as to the first matter, no, it's not a conspiracy. Everyone in Silicon Valley knows that you must not let people know how you do things. It's the most paranoid place I've ever been. And it's because a very, very smart person can walk into your establishment, understand it, and take your business. There's a classic example of this, which is at Xerox. I don't know if you know this, but Xerox invented the graphical operating system that we use today in the form of Windows usually. And then some dodo invited Steve Jobs to visit. And Steve, being a very astute guy, looked around and said, this is pretty good. And you know, 6 months later, Apple had it. Now, whether they bought it or whether they just copied it or got the idea, whatever, the point is it was a catastrophe for Xerox. They had many. Xerox also gave birth to what is now PDF. They didn't make a dime off of that either for the same reason. Some very smart people said, oh, this is a great idea, and walked down the street to Sand Hill Road, got a little money, and made a company. So no, it's not paranoia. And I will tell you, when I was in the Far East, I saw the process in action. Let me give you a very specific example. I was asked to be on a review committee for nanoscience in Taiwan, and at the end of the presentation, there were some people from a very astute laboratory. It has an acronym, ETRI, which basically gave birth to the entire Taiwanese semiconductor industry. And it's basically government-sponsored theft. And what I saw made my jaw drop, because not only was it deliberate and government-sponsored, but it was very good. So semiconductors were now a done deal. Now the target was paints and specific processes for making machine tools and biotech, specifically something called micellar drug delivery, which is a very big deal in drug companies. Well, so the problem you've got is that countries with different legal systems than you do can do predatory things by means of moving government money around that decimate your industries. And these IP laws that the Congress has been making, therefore, are not just evil people in Congress. They're pulling every lever they can think of to save the technical part of the economy from annihilation. Now, so no, I'm not making that up. That's true.
Dr. Laughlin over here on your right.
There's a whole bunch of it.
Hang on, I'll be up front
Remember,
in a minute.
Okay, sir.
Went on Amazon a few days ago to buy a book. I'd always wanted a Kindle like this gentleman had, because I thought 5,000 books going with me, cool. The paperback, the hardcover was cheaper than the electronic Kindle version. What you're talking about here today leads me to think that while Amazon promises me when I lose or drop my Kindle with the 5,000 books on it, I just get another one and they're going to download it to me, seems to me somebody could turn that stream off. So if I can buy hardbacks for roughly the same as electronics, I'd rather fill my basement with, you know,
Now,
a
listen,
whole
my friend,
library.
you and I are brothers, okay?
Okay.
Now, it turns out that this is another lecture, and you'll have to come back for my next lecture. But it turns out that I really got an education about the difference between print information and electronic information when I was in the Far East. The reason is, the key difference is not only that it's cheaper, it isn't cheaper usually, but the point is that electronic information is volatile. It's designed to be changeable. It's inherently impermanent. And that's fine if you're making trash information, but if you're making something important like the Constitution or a contract, you don't want those things to get changed post facto. You want them to be witnessed, and you want them to be permanent. And so we're talking about the economy of impermanence, okay, that's happened to literature. My dislike of that is one of the reasons that I now have a hat as a writer. That I don't want to make impermanent things. I don't have very much time on this mortal coil, and I want to make things that my grandchildren will look out and say, wow, he wrote that. They better, damn it. Let's see, there were some questions up here. Sir.
Working out on a problem without reading up on it first, you mentioned this in one of your biographies, helped you see things your predecessors had missed. Please elaborate on the process you use when you create something that nobody else thought of.
First of all, everybody does this. Everybody does this. Human beings are inherently creative. That's what language is. And so the one sentence answer is that I grew up slow, and I was childish longer than other people. Now, the other answer is that science has political aspects just like anything else does. And what often happens is the money is flowing in such a way as to discourage innovation. And ironically, we label that stuff innovation, but it's actually anti-innovation. So it turns out what really had happened at that time was I'd been fired. So I had been at Bell Labs, and I really wanted to get a job there, and I didn't. And so I was sort of at adrift, and I was at what they call the cooler at the Livermore lab, waiting for my clearance to come. And I was a man with nothing to lose. So I just erased all those people and solved it. Now, they could have done it too if they'd done the erasing, but they had too many stakes on the table and they couldn't. But at that particular time in history, I had nothing, and so I was lucky to have nothing, and I worked it out. Most breakthroughs in science aren't like that. They're lucky accidents. In this case, the experiment was the thing that counted, and I was also very fortunate that I had ace experimentalists as friends who knew I was competent, and they asked me, Daniel, there's a very interesting prize. It was completely circumglobal. So I was born and raised in California. Sturmer was born and raised in Frankfurt. And Tsui was born and raised near Hong Kong. He was actually born in mainland China. And Daniel Tsui is just one of those sort of real scholars. He's just the sort of classic Chinese scholars. And he listened to me, God bless him. And so he knew that the thing they were measuring was a charge. He understood that. And so what Horst tells me the story is that the thing came out of the strip recorder that night, and Dan went up to it with his fingers like this, and he said, 1, 2, 3 corks. Now, it turns out the Bell Labs wouldn't let them publish that. Okay? So they just published the data, and so I smashed them. But anyway, Dan knew, and so I owe it to those guys for having given me a little crack in the door to solve the problem. So a bunch of serendipity, basically. Yeah.
Dr. Laughlin, I'm wondering whether what we're hearing tonight isn't somewhat cultural, that we can relate to what you're talking about, but if this was an audience full of Amish farmers, would they understand what it means to have not open the mind scientifically? Are they missing something for the betterment of their lives by not being part of the scientific world?
First of all, I don't know any Amish farmers, but I do know farmers, and I think it's almost 100% certain that they would understand if I explained it to them, because they're smart. Now, it's not immediately in their lives, and people do eschew things like electric power and cars in Amish life. But when the baby's in trouble, you go to the hospital, okay? So you know what the priorities are. When it's really important, then you deal with technical things. Now, the larger context here is, of course, that we can't live without machines. So the Amish life is actually built upon something else, which is a mechanical world around it. And if the mechanical world were to fail, then the Amish life would fail as well, because there wouldn't be any supplies for it. But anyway, the answer to your question is, would they understand? And the answer is, it's not in their immediate environment, and so they wouldn't, I have to work on it to get them to pay attention to it. But yeah, they'd understand. Yeah.
Secrecy is competitive, and transparency is cooperative, and I would like to hear you say that the human race is going to be better off with a little bit of good-hearted cooperation to go with that competition.
Well, there's a reason. Okay, so to repeat the question, he says, why don't we talk openly about competitiveness versus cooperation? And somehow I know I'm in the Midwest now. Where's Garrison Keillor? I normally don't like to take a stand on that because I have disparate audiences. And often that issue becomes very ideological. And so the thing I'm talking about in my talk here is not an answer to this problem, but maybe identification of it. Now, how we as a society decide to deal with it is yet to be determined. And it could be we decide that we don't like patent laws anymore, and we don't like copyright laws anymore, that we want to get rid of them. My guess is if you did that, publication as we know it would disappear. And maybe a large amount of our remaining industry would disappear. Certainly films would disappear. But this is out of my hands. This is not, I'm not elected to any office, and I honestly don't know how it's going to come out. You can't ban competitiveness at some level, I think. I just think you can't, and the reason is because all of us want more than the other person, and that's just the way we're built. Everybody fights it, but when push comes to shove, your own family comes first, your own house comes first, your own well-being comes first, and that's the way it is all over the world, including, as I said, communist countries. So yes, more cooperation would be better, but I really like my house. And really like my house, and it's true. I'm the worst of them all. You know, if my kids are at issue, right, I'll do the most evil things to make things better for them. So, right.
Professor Laughlin?
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I have a follow-up question for
Sure.
the previous. So, I agree. I'm on your side, but I want to play devil's advocate just a little bit.
Okay.
So, while it may be very, very difficult to obtain weapons grade 239, you know, multiple kilograms to create a subcritical mass, it's not so difficult for an unhappy graduate student over in biology to buy a kit off the internet and splice a pox virus or something similar to that, where they would decide to end their life maybe spray a Nebraska game before everybody goes in there. What model do you think would work in order to have open access? And do you think that, now this is an extremely important question. Do you think that our high school education system and our inability to teach and open up is one of the roots of why we can't have this kind of model? So it's a two-part question.
All right, it is a two-part question, so let me answer the first part first. You don't have to make theories about the biology side of the equation. You can just look at what's happened, okay? It is a fact that certain kinds of activity have ceased. And part of the way it happens is with funding algorithms. And the basic idea is that back in the 1950s, people discovered that the criminal provisions of the Atomic Energy Act were not necessary for stopping the behavior they didn't want. All you would have to do is take away the person's money. Okay? And so that's how it's handled now. We talk about it as voluntary censorship, but that's not what it is at all. It's just turning the money on or off depending on what people are doing. And you ask, why couldn't somebody just make a dangerous bug? Well, it turns out it's hard, that's why. It's hard to do. It's easy to do some bungle job, okay? But to make something really dangerous is difficult. Now, it has been done. There's the famous example of the mousepox experiment that happened in Australia, where it was an interferon swap that these guys did, and they made the mousepox fatal. And heaven knows how much of stuff like that is happening inside government laboratories. But the point is, doing that, people don't understand what they're doing, and therefore to make something, change the genome that's really functional and does something bad is really hard. I mean, almost impossible. And when you figure out how to do it, what you typically do is quickly go make a company. And don't worry about killing the world because you're going to make a killing in the stock market instead. But that happens very, very rarely because the alleged age of biology that we're in is actually not here yet, because the knowledge of how the darn thing works isn't there. So I'm not concerned about that at all. Then you ask about the high schools. Are high schools causing our problem? When I was in Germany, this is amazing, you'll not believe this. I had people telling me they had been to America to study the American education system. And I'm thinking to myself, what? What? Coles to Newcastle. What? Well, it turns out that they have exactly the same difficulties that we do. It's a more monoethnic culture, but it's the same difficulty of continually mounting prices and then a bunch of unemployed students after they get out. And so the answer, my response to you is that the fact is our education system is not as bad as it looks. Okay, you're comparing yourself with Europe, particularly in Japan, but it's not a fair comparison because they're not educating the people. They're educating this sort of upper half of 1%, and that's what you see. But the rest of it is on par with what we do. Yes, you can always make education better, but in the information age, the education that's going to make you money, I don't think can be given away free. I don't think public education can ever do that because it's trying to row upstream against the laws of economics. And I'm sorry, I mean, I wish it were otherwise because I myself am an educator, but I've just seen too many great stuff behind the fences. And so I think that particular dream can't be.
Are they going to find the Higgs particle?
I hope so. This is another talk. Because it would be hard to imagine anything less important than the Higgs particle. And the larger context there is that this is sort of one of these Cold War issues that I told you. The true reason that we built all those big accelerators was as an insurance policy against nuclear weaponry. Nobody knew whether there was something beyond nuclear physics that would make an even more terrible weapon. And so they couldn't afford to have country X finding it out before you did. So everybody was building the same accelerators and watching everybody else. Unfortunately, what we've learned is that what's up there is a desert. Okay? And so that's good news. That means there isn't going to be any super weapon. But as I said, the end of the Cold War was bad for physicists. So the Higgs particle, if they find it, the truth is it won't affect anything, one way or the other if they don't. As a reductionist, you know, I have put on my reductionist, I really hope they do find something because I'm myself very interested how the universe works at that level. But, you know, nobody's going to pay me to do that. And so it's lower on my priorities than other things. Okay. Folks, okay, there's one more. I think after this question, I'm going to adjourn, and then because it's getting late, and you know, because it's not polite to keep people long, but I'd love to answer more questions after we quit. So feel free to ask afterwards. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about sequestered science and the history of classified science, as you mentioned, radiation, the Atomic Agency, but resulted in the radiation experiments that were exposed by President Clinton that were very widespread and caused a lot of damage to people. How would you see the current situation compared to that situation? Because we're in basically a technology race, an information race that includes, like you said, genetics, nano, bio, info, cogno, and what kind of risks do human subjects might face if we have secret science that has very little oversight?
Okay, so I can answer that. I can comfort you on that. It turns out that most scientists are idiots. And so that's the fundamental reason you don't have to worry about that stuff. Is there such a thing as nanoscience, or is it an oxymoron? Same question about neuroscience. And being a notorious contrarian, I tend to lead to that side, that mostly what these movements are a means of raising government money. And the actual scientific content of them is very little. Now, as for the secret experiments, this was the Cold War, and lots of stuff was secret. It turns out, however, that the nuclear radiation accidents, I reviewed that literature last year when I was writing my energy book, and it turns out that the really important papers came out in the 50s, came out in the early 50s. If you wait a minute, I can probably think of the name. I definitely have the reference, and I could give you to there. And what I mean by the important paper is an important paper is very easy to spot because you can read it. It's perfectly, you know, the person was trying to communicate, so it's not complicated. You know, this patient, this happened, and this patient, this happened, and we make this measurement, and here's what it was. And so those accidents were actually recorded in the 50s. And this is how you know what the symptoms of radiation sickness are. It's because those accidents were recorded. There are also tremendous records that have been kept in Japan over the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. Very, very excellent medical studies which show fascinatingly that there was a cancer cluster, leukemia cluster right after, but nothing else. There was no measured signal of monsters or defects in the birth that was not there, and there were no other significant cancer signals. Same goes with Chernobyl. It turns out there's just a crack team of doctors that was working in Ukraine over the last 40 years now, I guess it is, studying the behavior of human populations there. And there, you know, there was a thyroid cluster, thyroid cancer cluster, chiefly in children, coming presumably from tainted milk. But there was no leukemia signal. And once again, there was no measurable birth defect signal. Now, these papers are in the public domain, and so you can read them yourself and decide whether you trust them. I just kind of have a sixth sense about it. These were very, very good physicians, and I just think I trust them. So in the cases where you had really bad radiation accidents, you have good records because of people who've been on the job for decades. And you read those papers, and that tells you what the scoop is. The other military stuff, all I can say is, for better or worse, it's written into the Constitution that that our government should protect, to defend the country, and part of defense involves secrecy with technical things. And sometimes some awful technical things get hidden for a while. But in the case of the radiation, I know the literature of that pretty well, and you sort of know what the scoop is. It's awful, but not off scales awful. All right, at that, let's break now. Everybody, thanks once again for coming. I love audiences. So very good. That's good.
Thank you, Dr. Laughlin.
Yeah.
And your book will be out in September?
God, I hope so.
All right. We'll have it here at the library.
I need the money. Bye. So much for sharing knowledge.
Thank you for attending tonight's lecture, and please join us next fall. We have Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Jane Smiley, a book to speak on the man who invented the computer, and also Steve Sasson, the man who invented the digital camera, will be here in October. Thank you and good night.